All right, here we go. Welcome to the next segment in our online conference Restoring Civil Liberties. I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, the sponsor of this conference. Thank you for coming back, and thank you if this is your first participation in this conference. We've already got several lectures online, and the way the format's going to work tonight is our speaker will speak for around, 45 minutes to an hour. And then we'll have Q&A. If you want to ask a question, it's got to be done with the Q&A button there at the bottom of your screen. So just type it out and we'll get to those at the end of the session. If you're new to the Future of Freedom Foundation, come and visit us at fff.org for around 31 years of principled arguments on libertarianism. That's our mission. It always has been to present the uncompromising principle case for the libertarian philosophy. We've got a great FFF Daily, which we have long strived to make the best libertarian commentary page on the internet, free every day. All you got to do is register for it. We've got a great monthly journal that we've been publishing for 31 years, Future of Freedom. We've got our weekly internet show called The Libertarian Angle that is co-hosted by our guest speaker tonight and me. So, and then of course, we've got our YouTube channel. So it's a real pleasure to introduce our speaker tonight, and an honor as well. Richard Ebeling and I go back a long ways. That when I was living in Dallas, I was a native Texan. I was practicing law there before I went full-time into the libertarian movement. And I was taking a tutorial in Austrian economics on the side as I was practicing law with the head of the department there, the economics department. And we had gone through Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations and some of the classical economists, John Stuart Mill and so forth. And then we worked our way through Carl Menger's Principles of Economics, which is the first real Austrian economics book ever published. And then as we were going to move into Ludwig von Mises's magnum opus, Human Action, the head of the department, Sam Bostev, says, well, I'd love to continue this tutorial, but in good conscience, I should turn you over to this new guy I'm hiring named Richard Ebeling. He's a guy in your age group that knows more about Ludwig von Mises and human action and Austrian economics than anybody else in your age group. And so why don't you see if you can strike a deal with him? So we struck a deal, and Richard tutored me every week. Every Friday afternoon, we would meet to discuss a chapter of human action. And then later, I went to the Foundation for Economic Education in New York, became the program director, left the practice of law. And Richard went and became the Ludwig von Mises Professor of Economics at Hillsdale College, where he was for several years. And then after a couple of years, I decided to start the Future of Freedom Foundation. And Richard served as Vice President of Academic Affairs for FFF from the very beginning and for several years thereafter. And then he went on to become President of the Foundation for Economic Education, where he served for several years. He went to Northwood University after that. And today he is the BB&T Distinguished Professor of Economics of Free Enterprise Leadership and Ethics and Enterprise at the Citadel. So he has a distinguished career, and let me give you some of his books that he's published and written. He's got For a New Liberalism that was published by the American Institute for Economic Research, Austrian Economics and Public Policy, Restoring Freedom and Prosperity, that FFF has published. Also, FFF has published Monetary Central Planning in the State. He's also the author of Political Economy, Public Policy, and Monetary Economics, Ludwig von Mises and the Austrian Tradition, that was published by Routledge Publishers, and also Austrian Economics and the Political Economy of Freedom, that was published by Edward Elgar Publishers. He's the editor of a 3-volume selected writings of Ludwig von Mises, published by the Liberty Fund, the co-editor of When We Were Free by Northwood University Press, an anthology of essays devoted to the moral, political, and economic principles of the free society, and co-author of the 5-volume In Defense of Capitalism by Northwood University Press. So it's a real pleasure and an honor to have Richard Ebeling. He's my co-host for the Libertarian Angle, our weekly internet show at FFF. Richard, welcome to our conference, Restoring Civil Liberties to America.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, Jacob, and to be with the viewers who are very kindly joining us for this program. Back in the 1970s and 80s, former President Ronald Reagan used to like to collect anti-Soviet jokes during the Cold War. And one of those jokes that he particularly liked was about two men, an American and a Russian, debating over whose political system was freer and more respectful for the rights of the individual, America's political system or the Soviet system. And finally, as they're going back and forth, the American says, I could go into the Oval Office at the White House and I can look right in the eye of the President of the United States and say, you are incompetent, misguided, and do not deserve to be reelected. And the Russian looks at him and said, I have the same freedom in the Soviet Union. I can go into the office of the General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, bang on his desk and say, Ronald Reagan should not be reelected because he's competent and misguided. Wait, where's the laugh track? Where's the applause sound? That Hornberger, he's so behind the times, he doesn't even have the technology of a 1960s sitcom. Oh, wait, okay. Anyway, what was this joke saying? That one system had freedom of speech and the other did not. And this was systematic of the way humor was seen about the Soviet Union. One other. A little Soviet peasant, Russian peasant, comes in from the communal farm, the collective farm, into the local small town to vote in one of the Soviet elections. He's holding in his hand a sealed ballot, and he's about to drop it into the box, the old-fashioned one where there's a slit where you drop the sealed ballot in. And just as he's about to let it go, he pulls it out, and he starts opening it, and this big, burly Soviet militiaman comes over, being the police, and says, comrade, what are you doing? And the peasant looks at the policeman and says, but comrade militiaman, I was just opening the ballot to check who I had voted for. Comrade, don't you know? This is a secret ballot. Got a secret ballot. That could be a pop quiz. Now, finally, it used to be said that there were two television channels in the Soviet Union. On channel 1 was the Soviet government's official news about domestic and international affairs. On channel 2 was a KGB agent telling you to turn back to channel 1. Now, all of these jokes were pointing out that the particular quality of the Soviet system compared to the American system in general was that in that country, while they could talk about, oh, there's freedom and the citizens have a special opportunity that the evil capitalist system does not. In fact, the average individual had none of the civil liberties that we take for granted. Freedom of speech. Can you really say in the face of a political leader that you think he's incompetent and undeserving to hold that position? Do you really have the freedom of political participation, where in fact every election is really rigged and it's already determined who's going to be the winner of any election campaign, particularly when there's only one party that's running? And finally, what is the meaning of freedom of speech or freedom of the press, when in fact the only news and reporting and information you receive is what the government itself wants you to hear? Now, for Americans, those kind of jokes during those Cold War years reminded them very clearly that what America had were things that were very precious to hold on to, things that had always been taken for granted in the traditions and the history and the institutions of the American experience, things captured in those premises in the Constitutional Bill of Rights, especially such as freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of religion, freedom of assembly, freedom to a fair trial, to be secure in one's person and one's property. And that regardless of what may have been said in the Soviet Union, This was not the case there. It's worth keeping in mind as a sort of juxtaposing of these things, is that in the 1930s, Joseph Stalin, then the dictator of the Soviet Union, had a new Soviet constitution written and passed by the trumped up Soviet legislative authority. And if you read this 1936, 1937 Soviet constitution, you find that it has laid out all of the civil liberties that we as Americans take for granted. Freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, freedom of religion, freedom of association, freedom to be secure in one's person and property, and of course, all of the additional socialist freedoms, a free apartment, a guaranteed job, a certainty of a government-provided retirement pension, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And in fact, those on the left, the progressives, those sympathetic towards the Soviet experiment, said, you see, in the Soviet Union, you can have all of the standard civil liberties that we take for granted in our own country, but we'll also have those social guarantees as well, with nothing threatening or impinging on the traditional freedoms that an American takes for granted. It isn't less freedom, it's a new and better and extended freedom. But most Americans, most people in the West during those decades of the Cold War, who were not were themselves ideologically and somehow politically connected with socialist and particularly strong left progressive ideas, understood that this was just a mirage, something that was not true. That in fact, that system may have said that these things were holding to be the case on paper, in the print of the document, but that the reality did not back it up. The question is why? Why wasn't it the case that it was not secure and protected? And part of the argument that I want to make this evening with you is that the only institutional setting that really assures, guarantees, upholds the type of civil liberties that we speak of is our type of system, or what's left of it, of degrees of private property, sanctity of contract, freedom of association, the supply and demand of the market price, the people freely exchanging their ideas and agreeing upon terms of trade through the prices that they mutually accept in the buying and selling of goods and services and in the marketplace of all and sundry types. Without them, there are no such civil liberties. Let me sort of draw upon an example here in the United States from the 1950s. And this is one that particularly the well-known free market University of Chicago economist, Milton Friedman, would often more than once hammer away at. He pointed out that in the early 1950s, as some of you may remember or recall or have read about, there was the anti-communist scare. It was the early years of the Cold War. Stalin had grabbed and put a stranglehold on Eastern Europe. Mao Zedong had conquered the mainland of China. The United States in 1950 got embroiled in this war in Korea against communist North Korea, and then the Chinese communists intervened. The French were fighting the communists in Vietnam, then known as Indochina, and there were the threats of subversive leftist revolutions in Central and South America. And in this environment, Americans were sort of heated up to become concerned about subversion and fifth column, that is, supporters of the Soviet Union at home. And in fact, there were such spies. I mean, there have come out what's known as the Venona papers, and some of the Soviet archives with the fall of the Soviet Union were opened. And in fact, there were a wide variety of sympathizers, fellow travelers, and actual Soviet agents in the American government in the 1930s and into the 40s of the war years. But what happened beyond this was the idea that there had to be these investigations, the House Un-American Activities Committee, and they were calling witnesses. And there were people who maybe had been members of the American Communist Party in the 1930s during the Great Depression, or had attended some meetings of some socialist group, just trying to, what's happening? There's unemployment, production has fallen. Well, how do we get out of this? And sometimes innocently. You notice I talked about there were Soviet agents and Soviet fellow travelers, but sometimes they were just people trying to figure out what is going on, and for a while attended those kind of meetings. And there were some in Hollywood, screenwriters, actors and actresses, directors. And so these people were brought to the House Un-Americans Activity Committee, and they were grilled. And most of them basically hid behind the Fifth Amendment, believing that they were being unjustly persecuted publicly for what they viewed as their right of freedom of speech, freedom of conscience, that listening to communist ideas, attending a socialist youth movement in the 1930s was not an act of subversion per se, and that therefore their civil rights were being violated. Now, there were particular pressures from Washington put on the Hollywood movie studios to basically set up blacklists. And a good number of these suspected and accused and screenwriters and directors were basically cut off from their employments in the Hollywood movie industry. And this became a cause celeb, as they say, among leftist and liberal democratic movements and groups ever since. Movies have been written about them. But what Milton Friedman pointed out is that whether they were real sympathizers of the Soviet experiment or just flirted with socialist ideas, trying to figure out what the hell was going on in the midst of the Great Depression, or whether they were really active in trying to introduce sort of a left perspectives and ideas in Hollywood movies, what happened to them when they were blacklisted from the Hollywood studios? Was it like the Soviet Union, where particularly during Stalin's years and even after, if you were a critic accused to be an enemy of the people, a wrecker threatening the Soviet experiment, what happened to you? You could be arrested. You could be interrogated, including tortured. You might be just shot in some basement cell of a KGB building, or you might be sent off to the Gulag, that is the slave labor camps that were sprinkled throughout the Soviet Union, especially in Siberia, and worked to death. Or even if you survived it, exiled to some obscure corner in the tundra of Siberia for the rest of your life. That's what happened to those who criticized or were viewed as enemies of the Soviet Union, the real victims of a socialist system. But what happened here in the United States? Yes, they lost their job because of political pressures put on the studios from the political powers that be in Washington, D.C. But what happened was that these people were not arrested. They were not sent into a labor camp. They were not shot. What happened was that they had to find other ways of earning a living, given that they were let go from their Hollywood employments. And as Milton Friedman argued, virtually all of them found alternative lines of earning a living. It may not have been the one that they wanted to do. It might have been a far lower second best, including not only the work that they did, but the salary they could earn. But the fact was, the United States had a vibrant, decentralized, and diverse private enterprise sector. That meant that even if the government put pressure on one set of employers, the Hollywood movie industry, to say, let these people go from their jobs and don't let them work there anymore, the government could not prevent each and every business and enterprise and corporation and small mom and pop enterprise from hiring these people into alternative employments. In other words, private enterprise enabled these people to find means of earning a living and still holding whatever beliefs that they wanted to as individuals, regardless of what the government and those in government were trying to do through the pressure that they brought to bear on Hollywood. Now, why was this possible? Well, Milton Friedman argued and emphasized, particularly in the opening chapter of his book on capitalism and freedom, in which he talks about the link between political and economic freedom, that the ability of people to not be hounded out of a job and left to starve or to be worked to death in a labor camp was the fact that there was a sector, a part of the American society outside of, independent, and not beholden and intimidated completely by the United States government. Now, what made this possible? And the gist of, or a core part of my argument this evening, it's the institution of private property and the institutional arrangement of open, free competition between supply with the forces of supply and demand. How so? If you lost your job in the Soviet Union, there was no alternative employer. The reason being is that the government was the only game in town. The very essence of Soviet-style socialism was that all of the means of production, all the land, all the resources, all the raw materials, all the factories, all the machinery, were nationalized and taken over by the government. The government was the only employer as well as being the only producer, which means that if you needed a job and for your perceived or believed political views, the Soviet government said, you're hounded out of your current job. There was no other place to go because the government could see that you did not work any other place because the government was the employer everywhere. This meant that you either followed the party line, kept your mouth shut, or lived in fear that for whatever reason, someone would inform on you and make the accusation that you were an enemy of the state and begin the process of what they called the conveyor belt of arrest, interrogation, torture, imprisonment, slave labor camp, death. In the United States, there was private property. And the private property was viewed as under the ownership and the right of exclusive and determined use by the owner-employer of that property. And if he did not want to follow the government's dictates, there was not directly and often not even indirectly that the government could do from hiring you. It could have been someone who maybe shared similar left of center political views, or it could have been someone who just said, this person has qualities and skills and talents that will help make my enterprise profitable. And he hires him, not caring about the person's politics. And in fact, today, when you go for a job interview, even with all of the political correctness and the ideological nonsense, how many employers grill you on your politics? You have to be working at a university applying for an academic position. How many employers grill you about your politics before they're going to hire you for any job having nothing to do with politics or economic or governmental policy? Very few, they're very few and far between. It was the institution of a parallel set of enterprises, privately owned, independent of the government, autonomous of government influences, control, and manipulation, that enabled people to find alternative ways of earning a living and continuing to believe and express whatever views they might have held, even if those in political power wish to deny this. That is the importance of private property. Private property basically says that there is an area around you, both in your person and any physical property that you have acquired, either through your own work or through free, voluntary, and honest trade, that may be not touched upon by anyone, including those in political power. It is your domain. It is your kingdom, if you will. On your property, you are sovereign. And in your sovereignty, you may use it in any way you want. You may apply it to produce any product or service that you may think would be most profitable to trade away in the marketplace as your means of earning a living. You may contract and hire any worker that you believe will improve your productive capabilities in making a product that consumers want and at a profitable price. And you may not be touched by the government as long as you do not kill, you do not steal, you do not defraud. In other words, that is the meaning of freedom in the realm of property and personal choice in the marketplace. Without it, we don't have these opportunities. Time and again, this has been shown in one instance after another. Maybe some of you remember who are old enough that back in the 1980s, the Sandinista Marxists gained power in the Central American country of Nicaragua. And Daniel Ortega, who still is the dictator of the country, insisted at the time, here in Nicaragua, the people still have the same freedoms, even if we are a socialist regime, even if we're guided by Marxist Leninist principles, freedom of speech, freedom of the press. Well, at that time, in the early period of the Sandinista control of the Nicaraguan political system, there was a newspaper called La Prensa. It was a basically liberal opposition newspaper. And they continued to criticize, oppose, challenge the policies and the directions that the Sandinista government wished to take the entire country. Now, all this time, the Sandinistas said, look, La Prensa is publishing. Have we closed them down? Have we nationalized them? No, they're able to express their opposing views. There was only one problem. The Sandinista government had nationalized factories, including the printing press companies. They controlled the newspaper. That is, the paper used to print up newspapers. And now that they were introducing their version of planning, they had to determine the allocation of the scarce resources of the society for what they viewed as the socially most important, the socially necessary goals and purpose and activities. No, we need to take these scarce resources and apply it in our central plan for purpose X and purpose Y and purpose Z. Yes, La Prensa, we recognize their right to publish newspapers, but you know, because of all these different social priorities, we really can only afford to issue them so much paper to print up on the presses, so much ink to be used in printing up the articles in each issue. So that, in fact, by controlling the means of production, the printing facilities, the newspaper, paper, and the ink, they could strangle and limit the number of copies of the newspapers that the opposition paper could put out on a regular basis to try to offer an opposing view to the official government one. Once these private property rights are denied, the system becomes strangled. And finally, at the end of the day, there are no liberties. Another example of this is that the Soviet Constitution says said that there was freedom of religion, even though they talked about that God is dead, that there is scientific materialism, that the ideology of the society said that only secular ideas were to be espoused. The private individuals have freedom of religion. They can believe anything they want. They can express themselves in any way. They can congregate with others of similar beliefs. But was there freedom of religion in the Soviet Union or in virtually any of these other countries? No. And why not? Because the means of production, the land, the capital, the available allocation of labor, with the government as the only employer and dictator of what jobs were filled and for what purpose, basically meant that if the government did not want to allocate government-owned land to this group to build a church, if they did not assign the central planning task to a construction company to build the church, if they did not give central planning authority to some government-owned printing house to print up Bibles and hymnals, then what meaning was given to freedom of religion for people of a common faith to come together and worship and express their common values and ideas? None. This is why that in the Soviet Union, there were no such freedoms at all. Let me perhaps elaborate on this a little bit. I traveled in the former Soviet Union quite extensively in the last years before its collapse. I, in fact, was doing consulting work on market reform and privatization. And in one instance of this, I was doing quite a bit of consulting work in what was then the Soviet Republic of Lithuania. Lithuania, as many of you know, when the Soviet Union collapsed, like the other two Baltic states, Estonia and Latvia, reclaimed and regained the national independence that they lost during the Second World War through the deals that Stalin made with Hitler. Now, I was talking to a lot of Lithuanians, and one person told me that, and Lithuania is traditionally a Catholic country for centuries and centuries, that he was working in a government office, and to be able to get promotions, he had become a member of the Communist Party. His mother passed away, and there were some functioning, though limited, Catholic churches in the country. And so there were, in one of the Catholic churches in his family's small town or village, they were having a funeral service, and he wanted to go to his mother's funeral. His superior in this government office reminded him that he was a Communist Party member, and that as a Communist Party member, he had disavowed any belief in religion, that he viewed it as the false superstition and the opium of the masses to dupe them to fulfill the oppressions of the capitalists. And that if he went to his mother's funeral, he would throw into jeopardy not only his Communist Party membership, but his employment in that government office. Well, what if he lost his job because he went to his mother's funeral? He had a wife, he has children. Does he not have obligations, duties to see that he has an income coming in to support and put food on his family's table? And by the way, that would have been a government issued apartment that he and his wife and children lived in. If he lost his job in that government office, and the type of apartment that he was living in was a reflection of his rank in the hierarchy of the Soviet system, that apartment could have been taken away as well. So he had to stand 2 blocks away from the site of the church in his mother's town, so that he in spirit could be near the funeral, but he dared not go in and attend the service. That's what it means when government controls, dominates, dictates, determines the use of the means of production, land, capital, resources, and therefore the determination of employment for everyone. Now, you might say to yourself, well, you know, that's extreme. I mean, we don't have that type of thing today. That's not what America is about. Yeah, you know, the things are crazy here, but you know, we don't have that. But the fact we need to remember that to the extent that government interferes, controls, regulates, intervenes, influences all the various economic activities in the country, they therefore have the capacity and often do determine these things. We should also remember that, in fact, we do have various socialized sectors in American society. One of them is government schools. These are government-run schools. It is socialized education. You are forced to pay taxes to support it. The attendance is mandatory up until a certain age. And basically, it is the school boards that determine the curriculum of what will be taught and how it will be taught to each and every one of our children. Now, there have been several examples of what this does in terms of tension and people's sense that their freedoms and personal beliefs are challenged when government has this kind of control. You know, it used to be a few years ago that the controversies were, well, you know, should Darwin be taught in high school science, or should it be creationism? And these were huge fights about this. Now, you may believe that Darwin should be in the class. Maybe you believe that there should be creationism in the class. That's not the issue. Any more than it was the issue Do you think that every child at the beginning of the class day should put their hand over their heart and do a pledge of allegiance as the flag goes up the pole? Or do you think that that's an unnecessary and misplaced and sort of a pseudo jingo patriotic attitude that you think is misplaced and you don't want your child to have to participate in? Again, it's not a matter of whether you think it's appropriate to give this allegiance to the spirit of American ideas, or you think it's an example of misplaced nationalism. The issue came up because it was a government-run school with mandatory attendance, with compulsory provisioning of the resources to support it through the taxes collected. The issue then came up was who could gain control of the school board, because the school board would then determine the curriculum and the rules. Would it be Darwinian science? Would there be some creationism? Do we do the Pledge of Allegiance? Do we not? Do we have sex education in the class? Do Johnny and Sally have at the age of 8 or 9 picture books about how to do it? Or is that considered inappropriate for those young people and something that should be left to the home and the parents? There are battles about that for the same reasons. Who determines the curriculum and the pedagogy when it is a monopoly ownership of the government, and either you control it or they control it? Do we not see this now today in another setting? Okay. Critical racism theory. This idea that America was not founded on the principles captured in the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths: that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, among which are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And governments are instituted among men to secure those liberties. Did America have its beginning in those ideas, or did America have its real beginning in the events of 1619, when the first slave ship arrived from Africa, bringing a group of Africans in bondage to begin the slave experience of the Americas, the British colonies? And that therefore America is not a country based upon liberty, and freedom, and rights, but a society that has been from its beginning inherently racist and slave-based and oppressive and discriminatory. That all of America is a history of hypocrisy and brutality and racism. I'm not even really concerned about which of those two views you hold. I hold my strong beliefs about this. You may very well hold yours in one way or another. But why has it become such a burning hot issue that you see now? There are these conflicts where parents are going to school board meetings and getting these heated arguments with the school boards about not wanting their children to learn critical racism theory. And now a variety of these school boards have contacted the Attorney General of the United States that for parents to go to a school board meeting and to express strongly and vehemently and sincerely such criticisms of the curriculum being imposed on their children, this is domestic terrorism. The FBI has to investigate. It's because you have a government-run and monopoly institution. And either they control the school board and determine the curriculum and the pedagogy, or you control the school board and you determine the curriculum and the pedagogy. It's because it is a monopoly, government-owned institution. It is centrally planned in this sense and is imposed on everyone who is required to participate in that system. What would be the answer to that? And it shows the importance of private property and economic freedom to this type of educational civil liberty issue. What if education was just private? You chose the school that your son or daughter went to. They competitively were offering different pedagogies for education and learning subjects and arousing the interests of the students and the content of the curriculum. You want your child to learn X and Y and Z? That is the school you send them to and the fees and the tuitions you pay. You want your child to learn A, B, and C in terms of the subject matters and the teaching methods and the content. You send your child to these schools, paying the tuition. No property taxes or sales taxes to cover government educational institutions because they would have been abolished. That money would have remained in your pockets as citizens. You would have then decided what school you wanted your child to go to with the educational tools and content that you felt was most appropriate. If this sounds crazy, but at all these different views, is that not the case with religion and freedom of religion? Churches are private in the United States. They are not government funded. You have Protestant denominations, you have the Catholic Church, you have Jewish synagogues, you have Muslim mosques, you have Buddhist temples. You have people who don't believe in anything and just enjoy a Sunday or a Saturday or a Friday doing their own thing. And even in the different denominations, you go to one church of this denomination of faith or another church of this denomination of faith, and you often hear a wide variety of interpretations of what the holy book of that faith suggests is right and proper and true, and which should therefore be reflected in the conduct and actions of the believer. But it depoliticizes it, right? There's no arguments and debates and controls and sense that something's being shoved down my throat or that of my child. Each is at liberty and is free to share the faith that they want because you contribute with your own private money to help build the church that reflects your faith. You come together freely through free association and cooperatively to form a congregation. You hire the minister, the priest, the rabbi. You choose to go there and give donations or tithe during the services. You to supply the monies to do proselytizing if your denomination of faith views that as part of what's required of you as a believer. The government doesn't do it. It depoliticizes it. It creates a sense of respect and tolerance, and the government stays out of it. That is one of the things that has enabled America to be great. And I'm not ashamed to say that, rightly and properly understood. Why is it that in other countries you see wars and conflicts and civil wars? I taught years ago for a couple of years in Ireland, and that's when, quote, the troubles were going on in Northern Ireland. I was in the Republic of Ireland. And every night I would turn on the Irish television news, right, the evening news, and what would they report about the North? Some Protestants had killed Catholics, some Catholics had killed Protestants. Animosity, anger, resentment, fear. Why? Because the government controlled jobs, subsidies for industries, perks and positions within the political institutions themselves, the bureaucracies. Everything was politicized because the government was involved. You felt shortchanged. You felt discriminated against. You felt that the other group, because they had the majority and could control the parliament, had perks and privileges that you did not. And you felt that there was no way out of it, that your life was trapped in that. That's why the Catholics who were in part of this violence in the North, and I'm not defending the violence, okay, I'm just using this as an historical example, felt that their only recourse was to try to get rid of the British government so that they could live in a unified Irish Ireland. But that's the reason why the Protestants in the North resorted to their counter-violence. We don't want to live in an unified Irish Ireland where we'll be the minority and we'll end up being persecuted and discriminated against in government perks and taxes and regulations and subsidies. We want the British to stay in the North. We want to be part of the United Kingdom. It's because government was involved in all of this. All of this. I'm just going to give one more example. Many of you may remember that back in the 1990s, that was that terrible mass murder of people in the Central African country of Rwanda. 800 people supposedly were massacred between the Hutus and the Tutsis. Now, what is the difference between the Hutus and the Tutsis? The Tutsis are tall and the Hutus are short. Hey, that's a good reason to kill each other. No. A primary reason, besides tribal animosities that were, of course, would have gone back way in the past, was the fact that government was used to give perks and privileges outside the former colonial power of the Belgians wanted to use the government for certain purposes and gave perks to this group and not to that group, creating the tension, the animosities, and the resentment because life was politicized. And they were politicized because society was not privatized. And privatization means private property, freedom of exchange, freedom of association, tolerance of allowing the other person to have values and beliefs diverse and different than your own, as long as he respects your equal rights to follow your path, your way, as your conscience guides you. That is not possible without this. Look at the president of the United States right now, Joe Biden. He has told, because of government money, he has told nursing homes, unless every one of your employees is vaccinated against the coronavirus, I've instructed the respective bureaucracies to pull government funding for your nursing home and facility. Now, Joe Biden goes, I'm not forcing anybody to be vaccinated. It's not, my hands are clean. They're free to choose, to use a phrase, free to choose. It's just that government money that comes their way, it's just going to be cut off. It's a choice of the nursing home to decide whether or not they want to do without that money or to let go those who choose for their own personal reasons of conscience and belief or mistrust of the government or believe that it's not necessary to be vaccinated. The government money influences the freedom of choice that people have in the society. He who pays the piper calls the tune. These types of government spendings, these types of government regulations, these types of government impositions, these therefore dictate how people may live, how they can choose to protect themselves in one way or another as they see the dangers, including from a virus. In other words, to the extent that the government is introduced into the economic and therefore the personal affairs of the citizenry, liberty is denied. Government dictates, government determines, government demands, government controls. At the end of the day, there are no civil liberties: freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of religion, freedom of association, freedom to have peaceful and unmolested appeal for complaints to the government, to be able to express your criticisms and concerns. All of these freedoms are null and void without their support, basis, and institutional foundation in the respect not only for the right of the individual, but inseparable from that right of the individual to have private property and the freedom of association and decision-making that only a free enterprise economic system provides. Without private property and without economic freedom, at the end of the day, there are no secure, guaranteed, protected, and respected civil liberties. Thank you very much.
Okay, Richard, that was absolutely excellent. And so why don't we now move into Q&A? And let me begin with my own question, Richard. In the midst of all this COVID-19 controversy and all the healthcare debates and so forth, uh, and even before that, during the politics of the last presidential race, uh, it's been said that social media like Facebook and Twitter are censoring Americans, that they're engaged in censorship by taking people off their roles, that are saying things contrary to the accepted wisdom in Washington, and that something needs to be done about them, this power that they have, this monopoly power to censor people. What do you say about that?
First of all, I think that one has to accept that in a free society that both recognizes and respects private property and private enterprise. The fact is, if Google wants not to have certain things on their sites, if Facebook and Zuckerberg wants to censor and block people, that's their right. But I have confidence in one long run thing. Back in the 19th century, in the early part of the 20th century, it would often be said that there were these giant newspapers in New York, Chicago, San Francisco, Los Angeles, etc., and they dominated the political environment. What was said on the editorial page of this Chicago paper or that New York paper, it swayed and determined elections. But the fact is that over time, other newspapers arose, other means of communication and information emerged, radio and then television. So I'm sure that there will be technological innovations as people become upset and disturbed and want to hear different voices. The same way that a lot of conservatives who couldn't stand CNN or MSNBC were delighted when Fox News showed up. I'm confident about that. But beyond that, I do believe that besides the ideological biases and prejudices, and they're certainly there in the management and among many of the staff members and Google and Facebook, to use them as the examples that you're using, I think that behind it all is a concern that if they don't, quote, censor, restrict, confine what is said, how it's said, and by who it's said, government is going to come in and demand it from them. In other words, it's sort of, the force of intimidation that congressmen have said. It's come from the White House that maybe we're going to have to think that they have to be regulated. And so once the government says maybe you have to be regulated, and you would prefer not to be regulated, you then self-censor. Because you have to then do the things that you hope will minimize the likelihood or the rationale of the justification for your ability to make these own decisions yourself, to be taken away from you by the government, by a new regulatory agency, a social media, Department of Social Media Truth, like an Orwellian Ministry of Truth that, of course, fills everything with lies. But and I think that's part of it. I have confidence that in the open market, if enough people become upset with what Google does or what Facebook does, they'll devise ways to have different platforms, to have competing ones. I know that this has already happened with people who have gotten disappointed and frustrated with Facebook as a social communication. There are these alternative ones that are often far more secure. And so I have confidence in that. But the greatest danger, I believe, is the intimidating power of the government in basically nudging this far more than it necessarily might have been.
Okay. All right. We have a question from our audience that says, how do we teach Americans, especially younger individuals who have been indoctrinated in a government education system, the importance of the free market? That is to say, how do we teach the importance of general liberty and its relationship to individuals' dignity and their wealth development?
Well, it seems that it's sort of like David and Goliath in America right now, where Goliath is the government and we're a bunch of little Davids. But But just remember, in the biblical story, David did bring down Goliath. And I believe that if enough people who are concerned about the methods of indoctrination and educational curricula in our schools, from grammar school through high school, obviously the colleges, are willing to bear part of the necessary action on their respective shoulders. Everything has a cost, okay? Nothing comes free. And in this situation, it all falls upon each of one of us, given the constraints of our time and our family and employment obligations. But to the best of we can, to take upon our respective shoulders to find out what is being taught to our children, to try to become informed enough to counter this at home, maybe private social groups with parents who share the concerns and places where their kids could come together outside of these government schools to share lessons and stories about the real history, as I would consider it, of American liberty and the institutions of a free society and the history stories of great events in America that point out the value of individual liberty and free enterprise and the entrepreneurial opportunity for growth and prosperity. You see this right now with these parents who are going to these education board meetings and arguing with the board members and condemning them. Good for them, more power to them. But given that it is unlikely that they're going to succeed in swaying each and every one of these boards to move in a different political and ideological and therefore curriculum direction, then they should be thinking, and all of us should be thinking, of ways to find private avenues to replace this government indoctrination. Look, if I can add one other thing, I mentioned that I traveled in the Soviet Union in its last years. I had an opportunity to talk to many, many people of many different levels and stations and occupations and backgrounds of life in that society. And I, of course, not surprisingly, spoke to a good number of them who disagreed with, disliked, hated the system, but were stuck under it, right? And what a good many of them told me is that their kids, they're in the government Soviet schools, having to take their Marx lessons, their Lenin lessons, learning the history of the Communist Party, the Great Revolution. And what would these parents do? They took on the responsibility and the obligation to, how can I put it, debrief their children when they got home, to not believe what they were learning in their schools. Of course, then having to tell their children, don't tell your teachers what I've been telling you at home, because then the parents could get in trouble in that system, right? But that's what these parents are doing. Now, if this sounds, well, yeah, did this really go on? To make it somewhat personal, my wife is Russian. I met her in the Soviet Union. She has her PhD in history from Moscow State University. She taught history before she retired for many years, also here in the United States. Correct history. Her parents did that to her. She would go to these Soviet schools and say, oh, Uncle Lenin loves me. That's when she was like 4, 5, 6 years old. Oh, Uncle Lenin loves me. And her parents would sit down with her. Uncle Lenin, first of all, is not your uncle, and second of all, he sent your grandfather to a prison camp where he was tortured and practically worked to death. So he's not your uncle, and you shouldn't be viewing him as this great guy. But don't tell them what we're telling you. And before we were married, my wife was previously married and had a daughter, and from her first marriage, and she had to do the same thing with her daughter. And that, therefore, the real education occurred at home. Now, we're fortunate that we don't have to rely upon only books published by the Soviet press in America. There is independent press. There's YouTube. There are free market think tanks and educational organizations, such as what Jacob does here with Future Freedom Foundation. There's many places to go for the information, as Ayn Rand used to call it, the intellectual ammunition, to sift out the real fake news and to lay a foundation to share these things with the next generation. Since you can't rely upon the schools, it falls upon the shoulders of where, to be honest, it ultimately should belong, with the parents and the families and neighbors who share your values.
Okay, I'll ask you a follow-up question to your David and Goliath point. Are you saying that everybody should go out and start buying slingshots? I should also.
Do you see what I have to put up with? This has been for years.
All right, let me point out what I think you used to say, Richard. You can correct me if I'm wrong, that when you married Anna, that you were just doing your part in helping to privatize state property in the Soviet Union.
That is true. That is true.
Okay, here's another question. What happens when corporatism distorts capitalism to the point that our freedoms of expression, or relevant at the moment, our medical freedoms, such as our jobs, are at risk, much as they were in the USSR? My corporation sounds every day like an extension of the Democratic Committee. I'm smart enough, or cowardly enough, to know that I dare not say one thing against the woke preaching that is in my face every single day. That doesn't feel like freedom either.
I totally agree with that, with that questioner. And that is a major problem that we have today. First of all, we have to understand, in many ways, the problem we face in our society right now is even worse than if it was only the government. Because there are too many people in the society as a whole who share the same values as these collectivists and these political paternalists in the government agencies, bureaus, and departments, beginning with the White House right now. So that makes it far more difficult. So how does one respond to that until there can be enough of a groundswell for a political change and a cultural change? Well, let me give you an example of what the individual can do and is forced to do. Another example from the communist history. There was a very famous playwright in Czechoslovakia named Václav Havel, Havel. He was arrested for his dissident poetry and plays, and he eventually, by the way, became president of the Czech Republic after the communist fall. But he wrote an essay called "The Power of the Powerless," and of course he's talking about a totalitarian system, right? Czechoslovakia was a communist country, in the satellite community of the Soviet Union, and he was saying, well, what does the individual do? How does he speak truth, believe in truth? What is his power of the powerless? Because they control the state and you don't. And he said that the way you can be free of them and deny them is your decision to do some of the following. Of course, in the context of that Soviet regime in Czechoslovakia, you're forced to go to a government committee meeting, right? A propaganda meeting in your place of work. And you have to sit there, you're not forced to go to these meetings, but you're in big trouble if you don't. You can sit there and listen, but in your mind say, I know you're lying and I don't believe you. Second, if you have a little bit more courage than just to silently deny them your mind within yourself in that way. In your home, around your kitchen table, they had these small little apartments, right? Everyone would sit around the kitchen table with friends and family members who you could trust. Talk to them, keep alive the ideas of freedom, talk to them about truth and the history that's being denied and the freedoms that have been taken away and the importance of not giving into them within yourself and among your friends. And then if you're very courageous and you're willing to bear costs that honestly, in everyday life, it is difficult to be willing to bear. You go out and you protest and you oppose and you speak out and you criticize, even if you know that there are consequences to your livelihood and your personal liberty. You know, in this woke environment, if you speak out against your employer, you could lose your job. You're not arrested and shot. So that's the context in what Havel was saying that, right? You can be arrested and shot. But it all depends upon the degree of courage and circumstance one finds oneself in. But to be honest, it's very difficult to break this, other than to look for employment yourself. Take the initiative to where such ideological terror, and that's what this amounts to, and intimidation is not going on. And to cluster around those sectors and industries and companies and businesses in the society in which they have not and are not winning. But that's the way to do it until a wider change can be made in the society.
Okay, one person makes a comment. Excellent presentation. Thanks, Richard. All right, next, something that we see occasionally is that America is the last best hope of freedom in the world. Is this so, in your opinion? If it is, why does America shoulder this responsibility? And if not, where else might the flame of freedom be kindled?
Well, you know, the thing is that it all depends upon the context in which you're speaking. Many people who say that America is the last great hope for freedom will say, yes, surely you will agree that America is a freer society than the Congo in Central Africa, than North Korea under Kim Il-sung. It's a freer society than in Castro's Cuba, a litany of, or Assad's Syria, or under the Taliban now again in Afghanistan. That's obviously true. But that's not the context in which you should say, does America remain the last best hope of freedom as a beacon, as an example? What you need to do is to compare America not today against other countries where liberty is less, which of course that's true. Look, to be honest, would I want to live in some, what used to be called the third world country today? Or would I prefer, even with all going on, to live in America? By golly, I'd prefer to live in America. I'm just giving you my view. But where America is not free is comparing America today to, let's say, 100 years ago or 150 years ago. Ask yourself, what was the size of government in 1913, before the last year before the beginning of the First World War? All levels of government, federal, state, and local, absorbed less than 8% of national income. That meant that you kept 92% of everything you earned. And by the way, out of that 8% of national income that was taxed away by one level of government or not, most of that was at the state and municipal level. The smaller one was the federal government. They only took 3%. In 1913, that was really before any of the regulatory agencies emerged. FDA, the Federal Reserve, the Income Tax Act, all of these things. Individuals had a great latitude and liberty, a greater latitude and liberty in many corners of their life, particularly economic and financial, than they do today. Now, I know the response is, did women have the same equal rights as men? Of course not. But women had greater economic freedoms in spite of those legal impediments than in virtually all countries, including Europe. You're going to point to segregation in the South and prejudice against Blacks. Absolutely the case. But even in those instances, however condemnatory we would look back upon them as, most Black Americans, even with the lynching and the riot, anti-Black riots that would occasionally go on, which have no excuse, had far greater liberties than if they were in many other parts of the world, particularly, again, what we used to call the third world, parts of Asia, Africa, and Latin America. So yes, America was not an absolutely free country, particularly for certain groups and segments of the population. But if you look at the broad canvas of liberty as a whole, particularly in the concept category that we're speaking about right now, of economic freedoms, of no taxes and little regulation, America was a bastion and a beacon of freedom then, in a way that it should serve as an example for America to now for us to try to learn from. So is America a last bastion of hope? Compared to many other countries around the world, we still seem a lot freer and are freer in many ways. Are we the free country that we were, and however imperfectly, that we were in many parts of our lives in the past? No. And in fact, we need to remember and rekindle and reappreciate our history, the goods and the bads, to use it as a model and an inspiration to escape from what we have become and to have a vision of what we could be with none of the warts and pimples and discriminations and abuses that existed even in that economically freer America. And by the way, I have to add this. If it said, but in the South, yes. Why did the South have these problems for Blacks? Because there the state directly intervened in the economy through segregation laws. You could not freely associate. Blacks could not freely enter into employments. Blacks could not freely enter into businesses and enterprises, into contracts. It was the state that reinforced, prolonged, and intensified the prejudices. Take that away, and even Blacks, even with biases that people might have had, would have had it far better already. That, of course, is the aspect of the past that we would never want in a true free society. The state would not be involved in that any more than the other things that I've talked about this evening.
Okay, next question. How about political correctness and cancel culture? How does that fit into your equation?
Yeah, well, okay, a good part of this that we see in the colleges and universities today, where does the funding for these institutions come from? They're state colleges, they're state universities. They come from federal funds, they come from state funds. You're hired at a state university. It's, unless you're politically incorrect now, it's difficult to fire you, unless a mob rises up because they don't agree with your views. Again, suppose that colleges and universities were totally private, and they were dependent upon tuition only, and the generous benefactor giving of donations and endowments from free people choosing to do so. Would some people who share these views fund, woke nonsense at a college or university? They might very well. It would be a free country. But I do believe that if it was up to parents and benefactors who would be putting directly their own money, determining whether they supported, believed in, or wanted this type of curriculum, this type of education, this type of ideology in the classroom, a good part of it would immediately evaporate away. But the broader issue that the question is also talking about in political correctness and cancel culture is that this is all a politics of intimidation that arises from an ideology that believes no longer in any of these liberties. And it's made worse for Friends of Freedom because the state is involved in the ways that I've tried to touch upon a little bit, including just now about political correctness in higher education. But this requires a cultural fight, and because they've captured these institutions like government-funded education and can influence the media, and partly because they've indoctrinated those who are the journalists and media, because where did they get their education? From these people at colleges, and they go out and then share those views when they're employed. We have an uphill fight, but nothing is inevitable, but it requires a battle royal for us to make the case for liberty and to correct their errors, lies, and distortions wherever and whenever we can. If I can just say this, over the last several years, as all of this political correctness and identity politics and critical racism theory and so on has risen to the fore, in my little modest corner way, since I do kind of lecturing and writing, I've made a point of writing, trying to bring out these dangers and explaining their origins and where they are based upon false premises and are dangerous to the health and freedom of a society. each of us must bear a little bit of this burden again, as I was talking about educating our children to fight this, because there's no central plan where we ask daddy government to make it go away. We have to bear this ourselves. It's part of what freedom means, to establish and guarantee and restore freedom.
All right, let's take two more questions. First one is, are you concerned about how so many churches have taken loans from the government because of the pandemic lockdowns? It feels like an invitation for more government control of churches to me.
To the extent that any church has had to take or has accepted government funding to get over all of the things that have been going on over the last 10 years, they place themselves at risk. Because if they stay on that government subsidy gravy train for one reason or another, especially after this crisis passes, and certainly as long as the crisis is present, well, you then are running the risk of the government saying, oh, you have a faith that doesn't recognize gay marriage. You don't have a faith that recognizes abortion. You have a faith that on and on and on. Well, then they say, well, maybe we're not going to assure you any further this government funding for as long as you hold these anti-social views. I mean, they've tried to do this with the nonprofit tax status of several churches, right? They've already done this in the past. This is just another avenue of direct government money to reinforce those dangers. So you have to be willing to live a life without government largesse that you could survive without easily, or maybe not so easily, but if you want to be free of the government dictates. Again, like I said towards the beginning, he who pays the piper calls the tune.
Okay, I'm going to combine the last two questions. It seems that our side's in major retreat when it comes to freedom. Do you have any ideas on how we can stop retreating? And then the other question is, when do you see a tipping point when government power will be broken?
Okay.
So let's put those two together.
Yeah. Let me talk about, it's seeming as if, they're winning and we're not. Jacob will tell you that I like to read a lot about into the history of the old classical liberals of earlier times. And if you read some of these advocates of liberty, believers in freedom, in the years between the two world wars, the 1920s and the 1930s, who really cherished and valued the tradition of individual liberty, free enterprise, limited constitutional government, they were so forlorn. Look at the communists in Russia, Mussolini with his fascism in Italy, Hitler now with his Nazism in Germany. Now we have FDR with the New Deal in America. It's all over. There's no light at the end of the tunnel. And the fact is that, yes, all of those things have left their mark in negative ways. But we didn't become a totalitarian world. We didn't become Nazis or fascists or even in the Soviet style communists. All of those, for one reason or another, fell by the wayside. So the belief that the trend cannot change is not true. What it requires is the courage and the integrity and the determination to not become despondent. Another element in this is do not allow the other side to set the terms of the debate. You must have confidence in the power and the importance and the rightness of liberty. And again, to do your homework to the best you can, to understand why, to explain why, to reason and argue why, politely and courteously and non-offensively, but to help to set the record straight and try to devise ways, each one in their own corner with their friends, their family members, their co-workers, whatever, to try to devise ways to explain to their fellow human beings why these things are wrong and why liberty is precious and important and needs to be restored. Now, finally, a tipping point. They say in television and radio, you should never have silent dead time. And I'm doing a moment of silent dead time here, only because I'm trying to be reflective for an instant. there's a lot of ways to say what's a tipping point. When they totally deny freedom of speech, when they abolish freedom of the press, when it is just sufficiently intimidating and manipulating as it is today in the ways that I was discussing, seems to be the symbiotic relationship going on between Google and Facebook and the government. It's hard to say, but you can never know what a tipping point is until after the tipping point has occurred. And I think that one has to say that one can never know if one has reached such a tipping point. Imagine that you were in France in 1941 and 42. You could easily say, my God, the Nazis have occupied us. We're never going to get rid of these people. Well, the Germans were gone 2 or 3 years later. It's very easy to say, the commies, how are we ever going to defeat the commies? Look, they have nuclear weapons and they have all these guerrilla movements in the third world. They're winning. No, it's all over. Oh, and they're willing to die for their cause. Well, the Soviet Union imploded and disappeared from the political map of the world as an entity. So what's a tipping point? I think that we have to ignore tipping points and just focus on always believing that with enough courage, determination, and effort, and sharing this to create a larger circle of people, we can win, and to have the courage and belief that we will win.
Okay, we'll wrap things up by reading a couple of comments from the chat room. Speaking of politically incorrect, one person says that he loves the pipe rack in the background.
Okay, now, once upon a time, I used to smoke. I have not smoked for a very long time. In fact, I started smoking a pipe when I was 12 years old. I thought it made me look older and more mature. But I'm just emotionally attached to it. The carafe is empty of pipe tobacco, and the pipes have been clean for a very long time. But thank you. I like the pipes too.
Okay. The other comment is, the conversation is wonderful. I'm watching from Bellingham, Washington, and love the easy back and forth you two are having. I also love Richard's hardcore libertarianism. But I think it's fair to point out, Richard, and I think you would agree with me, is the reason that you're hardcore is that I've made you that hardcore. I mean, it's taken me, 35 years or so, but I feel like I've been a success.
I have had to correct his errors and omissions endless times. If you only knew the mental strain to correct his leaks from a freedom point of view. But I'm willing to bear that burden for the cause of freedom.
Okay, on that note, we'll wrap it up. Thank you all very much for tuning in. Next week, we got a special deal for you. We've got a twofer. We've got 2 speakers for the price of 1. And of course, the price is free. And we've got Radley Balco and George Leaf. And Balco is one of those libertarians that has been successful in the journalism field, tremendously successful, works for the Washington Post, and he has been so influential with respect to police abuse and civil liberties. And then George Leaf is one of the greatest writers. Those of you that get our monthly journal know that George periodically does book reviews for us. Just an excellent writer. I think you're going to truly enjoy next week. We'll go a little bit later, but I think you'll find it's worth it. So thanks for tuning in. Thank you, Richard. Excellent presentation. Appreciate you taking the time and the effort.
Thank you.